questions that have already been submitted over the web by our students taking the classroom credit. Okay, thanks a lot. And Janet, welcome.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you. It's very nice of you to invite me here. I'm truly honored to be part of this extraordinary series of lectures, and I thank you all for coming out on such a brisk winter day, especially when the topic is taxation. So thank you for coming. So we're dealing today with this question of ecological tax reform, theory and reality, looking at the ways in which we can harness the tax system, which in this country is $2.9 trillion, to try to achieve environmental taxation, environmental protection. So there are a number of different ways, once government decides that it wants to engage in environmental protection, that it can go about doing so. It can try to use education, consumer labeling, voluntary agreements with industry, liability regimes, regulation, a very traditional approach, permit trading, and then we have taxation, which is a relatively new player in this constellation of options. Now, taxation is one of the so-called market-based approaches to environmental protection. It uses the decision-making process of the market to try to achieve the environmental result. So the basic idea is really very simple. What we do is we want to adjust prices. We raise the prices of the environmentally damaging activities or products, and we lower the prices of the environmentally beneficial activities or products. So we're changing the price signals, but government itself can't set prices. So what does it do? It uses the tax system to try to send these price signals into the marketplace. And once it's adjusted the prices, we just let the market decide how it's going to respond. We use Adam Smith's invisible hand. So we take the invisible hand and we just place a little bit of weight in it, positive or negative, and tilt the hand. So the Adam Smith's invisible hand continues to work, but with a slightly different tilt to it, the tilt added by taxation. So today we'll look at the variety of theories that are used to try to support the use of environmental taxation and some of the challenges that we face as we try to implement it. And to pose the issue, I start with the following tale. Many years ago, there was an emperor who was so excessively fond of new clothes that he spent all of his money on them. He cared nothing about his soldiers, nor the theater, nor driving in the woods, except for the sake of showing off his new clothes. Life was very gay in the great town where he lived. Hosts of strangers came to visit it every day, and among them were two swindlers. They gave themselves out as weavers and said that they knew how to weave the most beautiful fabrics imaginable. Not only were the colors and patterns unusually fine, but the clothes made of this cloth had the peculiar quality of becoming invisible to everyone who was not fit for the office he held or who was simply dull. Well, as you know, the emperor bought the clothes, and then the emperor walked along the procession under the gorgeous canopy, and everyone in the streets and the windows exclaimed, "How beautiful the emperor's new clothes are! What a splendid train! And they fit to perfection." Nobody would let it appear that he could see nothing, for then he would not be fit for his post, or else he was a fool. So the question for today is whether, if the environmental emperor dons a mantle of environmental taxation, an inherently invisible garment by its nature, is the emperor venturing out into the environmental arena with a functional, effective garment, or is the emperor wearing a cloak of rhetoric that gives no protection? Can the theory of environmental taxation work in reality so that the emperor should buy the clothes? We'll look at this question in the context of the basic formula for environmental taxation. It's really quite a simple formula. We start by identifying something that we want to tax. That's the tax base. Something where we want to either raise the price or lower the price in order to achieve the environmental result. Then we tax it. We decide what the tax rate is, and we apply that tax rate to the tax base, and the result will have an impact on governmental revenues. If we're giving something a benefit, so we are reducing the cost, there'll be a negative effect on the tax revenues. If it's a tax increase, we'll be generating new tax revenues. So we'll look at this question of environmental taxation in three different ways. We'll look at the tax rate as a case study in the theories of environmental taxation. We'll look at the tax base as a case study in how tax policy considerations affect the design of an environmental tax. And then we'll look at the tax revenue issue, the impact of the tax on the flow of revenues as a case study in the politics of environmental taxation. And I'll conclude by seeing what all of this adds up to. Do the invisible workings of this market-based instrument provide positive environmental results of a solid weave, or are they like the emperor's new clothes, invisible and non-functional? And in exploring these issues, I'll tend to focus on the question of greenhouse gas emissions and global warming, and how we can use taxation to try to address that issue. But you should bear in mind that many of the issues and principles apply equally to other types of environmental taxation. So we start with the theories of environmental taxation and how they affect the design of the tax rate. And we start with a man named A.C. Pigou, a professor in Cambridge, England, back in 1920, who wrote this book, Economics of Welfare. One of his concerns was that private activities, which he called trade in 1920, didn't always serve the public welfare, which he called the social net product. In some cases, there was a divergence between the two. And in some cases, private negotiations between the parties could solve that. They could negotiate a result that led to their collective good. But then he went on and talked further about the problem. It is plain that divergences between trade, private interests, and social net products of the kind we have so far considered cannot be mitigated by the modification of contractual relationships between any two contracting parties, because the divergence arises out of a service or disservice rendered to persons other than the contracting parties. It is, however, possible for the state, if it so chooses, to remove the divergency in any field by extraordinary encouragements or extraordinary restraints upon investment in that field. The obvious forms which these encouragements or restraints may assume are, of course, bounties and taxes. So with those words, back in 1920, Pigou laid the foundation for the theory of environmental taxation. In today's terms, Pigou's theory is that we try to internalize the external costs of activities. If those costs are damages imposed on third parties or society as a whole, we bring them back into the price of the activity through the tax code. If someone is doing something that's generating a positive environmental benefit for which we, society, aren't paying, then society can compensate that person through a tax reduction. So his idea led to this notion of Pigouvian taxes. So how would we set the tax rate for a Pigouvian tax? What we would want to do is look at the external cost of the activity. So if we're thinking about global warming and CO2 emissions, we would need, for a theoretically pure Pigouvian tax, to figure out what the environmental damage is that's caused by each unit of CO2 emission. That obviously can be a theoretically difficult challenge. What costs do we include? How far into the future do we calculate the costs? How do we deal with the speculative nature of damage? You get the drift. Thanks to many people who are starting to work on this issue, we're starting to come up with better results, including among them the leaders here at the Gund Institute. But it's a theoretical challenge. Another theory of environmental taxation is the polluter pays principle. That's the idea that government imposes a tax on the polluters in order to make the polluter, quote, pay. Then it's a question of what is it exactly that the polluter is paying for? Because what the polluter is paying for should determine the tax rate. Is the polluter paying for the external costs of the activity? If so, then it's like a Pigouvian tax, same principle. Or is the polluter paying for the cost of governmental restoration of the damage that occurs because the polluter has chosen to pay the tax and continue the activity? That could be a different number than the external costs. Or is the polluter paying some amount that will result in a net reduction of pollution to society as a whole, paying the cost of achieving a certain result? And that, too, would be a different calculation. This theory hasn't been fully refined, in my mind, among policymakers as it's applied to environmental taxation. I think the drift is toward treating it as the same as the Pigouvian theory of internalizing external costs, but that remains to be fully decided. Another theory is the theory of least cost abatement. And our idea is that environmental taxation can achieve environmental protection in a more cost-effective manner than regulation. So suppose we want to reduce emissions by 10%. If we took the regulatory route, we would have everyone reduce their emissions by 10% regardless of cost. Alternatively, we could impose a price through the tax code and let people choose. If the cost of changing behavior is less than the cost of the tax, people will change and not pay the tax. If the cost of changing behavior is more than the tax, they'll choose to pay the tax. They'll pay but not change. But in the aggregate, if we've set the tax right, we'll get a 10% reduction in pollution overall. So we have this idea that maybe this is a more economically efficient approach. How do we set the tax rate? We have to look at the cost of the change in behavior that would be required in order to reduce emissions, and then we would set the tax rate just high enough to make sure that enough people reduce enough pollution to achieve our target. And again, this calculation may not be particularly easy, especially if different sectors have different alternative behaviors available that carry different price tags, or if for some less polluting activities, the technology is not available, so we can't price it. Or even if we know the prices of alternatives and they're the same, we still have to predict how people will react at a given level of tax given a variety of considerations. So it's a very complex economic calculation. So we would be looking for this rate that would a rate that would be high enough to generate the requisite amount of pollution abatement. One more theory, the last one I'll cover for the moment, this idea of a double dividend, which is becoming a very popular theory as well. And in this country, it's sometimes referred to as tax shifting. In Europe, it's called ecological tax reform by some people. So in the choice of the title for today's lecture, I've used the term ecological tax reform more generally to cover various ways of greening the tax code. So under the double dividend approach, what we do is we impose an environmental tax, something that increases the cost of an environmentally damaging activity or product. That tax is going to generate money. So what we do is we take the money from that tax, the revenue, and we use it to reduce some other tax burden that's dampening the economy. So double dividend, because we get one dividend of environmental improvement, we get a second dividend of some sort of economic improvement. And on balance, the total tax package is, in budget terms, revenue neutral. The flow of revenue into the government coffers doesn't change. We've just increased one tax, reduced another tax. So sometimes people shorthand this into tax bads, not goods, a button that some people have been seen wearing. How do we set the tax rate in this case? Well, it's tricky because to get our first environmental dividend, we use one of our other theories, so we have to use that tax rate. And then we have to make sure that that tax rate generates enough revenue to give us our second dividend. So we have to get a tax rate that in effect serves two masters. Again, a potentially complicated task. So, where does this discussion of theories and tax rates leave us? Is environmental taxation a real or an elusive mantle based on this discussion so far? First, I think that when we use environmental taxation, we need to be very clear about the theories, because the theories underlying the tax will influence the design of the tax, as I've illustrated through this discussion of the tax rate. And as environmental taxes move into the advocacy and the political arenas, we need to be sure that theory doesn't degenerate into comforting but meaningless rhetoric, a flow of indistinguishable rationales. Because each tax, based on our choice of theory, is different. They may overlap, and they will all affect prices so that they may affect behavior. But I think we need to start with clarity of theory, because the theory gives the goal for which we're striving. That said, we also have to frankly recognize the difficulties in implementing theory. For example, the challenges of calculating the external costs in order to internalize them. Plus, we have to recognize that even a theoretically sound tax rate may be modified by the political system. It may not be politically acceptable as it goes through the political negotiations. So in short, we have to engage in truth in lending when we talk about environmental tax theory. So if we have clarity and honesty in rhetoric, but we can't achieve perfection in reality, is the tax still worth pursuing? I'll return to that question at the end. So we just blacked out the system by pushing the wrong key. Sorry. I'll try to fast forward here. So we'll move on to the question of this tax base and the tax policy issues involved in working with the tax base. When we design environmental taxes, we want to try to find the object or the activity that will carry the price signal through the economy. So we start out by looking at the environmental effectiveness. We want to try to find some tax base that will suit our environmental purpose. And here I'll use the example of the tax on gas guzzler cars. In the federal tax code, we have a fairly substantial tax on gas guzzler cars. Any car that gets less than 22.5 miles per gallon according to its fuel economy rating. The tax starts at $1,000 and it climbs up to $7,700 for cars with ratings of less than 12.5 miles per gallon. This tax, as designed, sounds like a very good environmental tax, and in many ways it is. There's one problem. It has a loophole. The loophole is that it doesn't cover sport utility vehicles or light trucks. This tax went into effect before sport utility vehicles were popular. And needless to say, now the small loophole has grown enormously to cover a lot of garage doors. So one report indicated that in 1999, if the purchasers of sport utility vehicles had paid the gas guzzler tax, an additional $5.6 billion would have gone into the federal treasury. So we start out with looking at the environmental policy, making sure it's sound, and avoiding mistakes such as we see with the sport utility vehicle example. So we design a good tax base. Then we have to take the tax through the normal factors that one looks at in designing taxes. Administrative feasibility, the effect on the economy, and the effect on administrative feasibility, the effect on the economy, as two examples. So, administrative feasibility. Let's go back to this idea of a tax on carbon dioxide in order to address the global warming issue. Ideally, we would tax carbon dioxide that's actually emitted into the atmosphere, because that's what's causing the environmental damage. Problem though, we don't have toll takers sitting there counting the units of CO2 coming out of the smokestacks, the chimneys, or the tailpipes. So we have a question of administrative feasibility. What we do in this case is we say, well, most carbon that's in fossil fuels actually is combusted and actually does go up into the atmosphere, so we'll make that jump of logic. And it's not an unreasonable one in that case. But we always have to make sure that the tax we're designing is actually capable of administration. Then we need to look at the economic effect of the tax, because we don't want to have a tax for tax policy purposes that has an unduly damaging effect on the economy. In 1992, the European Union proposed a broad-based tax on energy. It was would be equal to about $3 per barrel of oil. It's when it started escalating up to $10 per barrel of oil in the year 2000. The primary purpose of the tax was the environmental tax, or environmental purpose of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the combustion of fossil fuels. So it was targeted at CO2, and consequently the carbon content of the tax was a very logical tax base. So environmentally, that would have been the route to go. Problem? Well, what happens if you only tax carbon, fossil fuels? You don't tax nuclear. That had two problems. One, the issue of environmental questions of nuclear, which are not associated with greenhouse gases, but are of their own ilk, plus an economic question. Some countries, particularly France, rely heavily on nuclear fuel. So if nuclear power is exempted, then France gets a competitive advantage over other countries. So from a pure economic perspective, the European Union had a problem on its hands. Its final result, it struck a compromise. It based half of the tax on the carbon content and half of the tax based on the energy producing content. So it split the result. So fossil fuels would have been subject to both halves of the tax, partly based on carbon, partly based on the BTU or energy content of the tax. Nuclear would have been subject to half of the tax. Well, now we've extended the tax to energy by taxing BTUs. What do we do with solar? We don't want to tax solar for environmental purposes, so we then exempt solar back out of the tax. So the European Union ended up not enacting that tax because the European Union, for taxes that would apply to all member states, requires unanimity of result of all of the countries. They couldn't achieve unanimity, but in the interim, since 1992, the majority of European countries have gone ahead and enacted their own carbon taxes. What has the United States done on this front of figuring out how to tax energy? Well, a month after he came into office, President Clinton proposed this country's first broad-based energy tax as part of a deficit reduction package of $500 billion. This is a sheet that the administration used in the process of promoting its tax. It promoted the tax in part on two environmental rationales: pollution reduction and conservation, as well as deficit reduction. And the question is, what was it going to use as its tax base? Would it use carbon or not? Here it was clearly a question of considering the economic impact of using carbon. Coal is very sensitive in the United States from an economic perspective. Certain regions are heavily dependent on coal for employment. Price of coal is low, so a tax would hit hard. And coal is very politically sensitive in the corridors of Capitol Hill. So purely for considerations of economic effect, carbon was not chosen as the tax base. The stronger environmental tax base was not chosen in favor of the economic considerations. So we did not pursue the maximum environmental route in that instance. Equity, that's another thing, another tax policy consideration that can have an effect on the design of taxes. In In tax terms, when we think about equity, we're really concerned about the ability of people to pay the tax. We want to make sure that they're not being unduly burdened if they don't have the ability to pay. So with the Clinton BTU tax, one of the political and policy issues was, what do you do about home heating oil? Home heating oil would have been taxed at the rate of 59.9 cents per million BTUs. And after a winter like this, you can imagine how people might be sensitive to price increases for fossil fuel. Environmentally, the right result would encourage people to conserve. It would encourage people to insulate, to think about alternatives. But the lower income people may be least in the position to modify their behavior. The end result was that the home heating oil provision was reduced, the tax was reduced to a lower rate of tax to give some relief for equity purposes. So, where does this take us? These are legitimate policy concerns that we have. Environmental taxation should start out with the idea that we want to try to achieve the right environmental base, but it will inevitably be modified by other legitimate tax policy considerations. We can't enact environmental taxes in a vacuum. By the same token, we should remember that other environmental instruments, regulation, tradable permits, for example, also get judged against their economic effect and their equity impacts. So we shouldn't necessarily think that taxation is a weaker instrument because it's viewed against these standards. But I think it is true that these issues become more politically visible in the context of environmental taxation. Now, who makes these tax policy decisions? When we're dealing with environmental protection normally, it's the environmentalists, it's the EPA, the environmental administrators and policymakers. What happens when it's taxation? We have a different set of characters all of a sudden. We have the Department of Treasury designing taxes. We have the IRS administering the taxes. We have the tax writing committees in legislative bodies designing them rather than the environmental committees, whether it's at the federal level or at the state level. This can lead to some interesting conversations and results. To when the Clinton BTU tax proposal was going through Congress, one of the issues involved was whether when you make aluminum, the electricity that's used in aluminum actually physically becomes part of the aluminum. If it physically becomes part of the aluminum, we shouldn't tax it because it's not being used as energy. It's being used as a component of the aluminum, or what they call a feedstock. Well, this is a technical issue, but it became quite a hot issue. And I will read you an exchange from some testimony before the Senate Finance Committee in 1993. Secretary of Treasury Benson was there testifying for the administration's proposal. And Senator Baucus from Montana had a concern about this provision of taxing electricity used in aluminum. He says, Senator Baucus says, Mr. Secretary, earlier this year I raised the question about the aluminum industry. I'm just curious of why there is no adjustment, because obviously the electricity used in making aluminum is a feedstock. It shouldn't be taxed. Secretary Benson, should electricity be used in the production of aluminum? When it is used, should it be viewed as a feedstock? In making petrochemicals, the atoms of the feedstock hydrocarbons become the atoms of the polymers and other products. This is the meaning of a feedstock in the administration's proposal. Aluminum smelting uses direct current electricity to split aluminum oxide into aluminum, metal, and oxygen. A molten aluminum collects at the bottom of the cell where it is drawn off periodically. Contrary to the claims advanced by some industry sources, electricity does not contribute net electrons to the reaction that contributes the energy that causes the chemical reaction to occur. Now, if you followed that, Senator Baucus, I see, laughter. So you get the idea. All of a sudden you have tax people who are significantly involved in environmental and technical issues. This represents a significant change in the spheres of power and the players in these spheres of power, and requires a new level of education. The Clinton BTU tax ultimately was not enacted. It was replaced by a 4.3 cent tax increase in the gas tax due to opposition primarily from oil-producing states. But I think the idea of a broad-based tax in this country for energy is not necessarily gone. For example, here in Vermont in 1998, the Department of Public Service, when it released its energy plan for Vermont, proposed that Vermont seriously consider the options of broad-based energy taxes. A carbon tax, even at the rate of $100 per ton of carbon dioxide, a broad-based BTU tax possibly, or sales taxes. So issues such as this are still potentially on the table. So, what are my conclusions about the idea of the influence of tax policy considerations? As I said, they're real, they're there, they potentially dilute, and at the end of the day, we always need to go back and figure out whether what we have enacted is going to be environmentally productive after we have taken the tax policy considerations into account. So now we go on to the third element of the equation, the tax revenue. And this raises some interesting political opportunities and challenges. If we have a tax subsidy, we're involved in a situation where we've got some commodity we want to encourage, so we reduce the tax burden. We're going to be losing revenue that otherwise would go to the government. That tax subsidy is going to cost taxpayers money or cost the government money. So then we have the question, what do we do about that? Well, tax subsidies are very popular in this country. We tend to like things that are on sale. So we have a number of tax subsidies that are environmental in nature in the tax code. President Bush, when he released his tax budget last week, his full budget last week, included some tax provisions that would reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. But these cost money. He would expand a current incentive for wind and biomass when they're used to produce electricity. That would cost over 5 years $1 billion. He would create an incentive for homeowners to install solar facilities in their houses, cost $71 million. He would give a bigger tax credit for alternative fuel vehicles, focusing in particular on alternative fuel vehicles for that use fuel cells. Cost of that over 5 years, $2.4 billion. These add up to about $4 billion. It's politically very easy to give tax subsidies, but they cost real money. So we either have to pay for them with other tax increases, or if we're in a potential deficit situation, we have to increase the deficit or cut other spending. So politically good, politically attractive tax cut, but difficult to pay for if we hold ourselves to the requirements of paying for it. If we're in the other position of saying, okay, we're not going to cut taxes, we're going to increase taxes. We'll raise the taxes on some environmentally damaging product or activity. Then we have a different picture. Trouble is, people generally don't like tax increases. So we have to find some political will for the tax increase. It could come out of the sheer political desire to solve the environmental problem. We all may decide we're willing to pay more tax to solve the problem. Or we can try to find the political will out of the new revenues that this tax is going to generate. We could say, aha, let's take those revenues and dedicate them to the environmental purpose. And maybe that will make people more sympathetic to the idea of paying the tax. Or, as President Clinton tried, we could say, let's take this revenue and use it to reduce the deficit. We've got a deficit, we should deal with it, so we need a new tax to reduce the deficit, so let's impose this environmental tax to solve our deficit problem. So I think it's pretty clear in the Clinton situation that the real motivation was not an environmental motivation, it was a deficit-driven motivation. Or we could go back to the idea of this double dividend. We can say, we really need to try to reduce some tax burden. Maybe we can achieve that result by finding this new source of revenue that will give us the first environmental dividend. We use that revenue to get our second economic dividend. That's what Germany, for example, has done. Starting in 1999, it's had a broad-based energy tax. It used the revenues from the tax to reduce Social Security wages, taxes paid by employers and employees. And it's interesting that about 15 years ago, the environmental community in Germany decided that the one way to get a broad-based energy tax was to not argue that the tax money should be used for the environmental protection side, but should be used for some other purpose. It would build a broader coalition for the tax. And in fact, in 1999, it was enacted because there was high unemployment and people wanted to reduce labor taxes in order to try to trigger more employment. So we can look at the double dividend side. And overall, it's pretty clear that somewhere we have to find the political will, and that the revenue side of the picture can be complicating in the case of tax subsidies, but may provide substantial opportunities in the case of environmental taxes that generate new revenue. So, what does this add up to? I've touched on a number of different issues that put into potential question the viability of environmental taxes. The risk that we use theoretical rhetoric that may be difficult to implement, the potentially eroding effect of other tax policy considerations, the political difficulty of raising taxes unless we have the right fiscal or political climate. So what evidence do we have that environmental taxation is still really worth pursuing? Environmental taxation clearly has become part of our policy and political vocabulary. The government, as I said, the federal government actively uses tax subsidies. It's also used some environmental tax increases. I think the most notable example is a federal tax on ozone depleting chemicals that was very aggressive and has proven to be effective. Vermont has a very interesting tax on sales of land when the land has been held for a short period of time and someone has made a high profit off of it. There's a tax on that speculative gain. The volume of activity in the environmental taxation area is increasing. In Europe, we've seen a significant increase in the number of taxes, and from 1980 to 1999, the revenues from environmental taxes increased by 14%. Not huge, but a significant new trend. European countries in general get about 5 to 10% of their revenues from environmental taxes compared to roughly 2% in the United States at the federal level by my tally. So these taxes are being enacted. They are generating revenue, but we still have the question of, are they working as an environmental instrument? And this gets to another thorny question. It's difficult to assess the actual effect of an environmental tax due to the very nature of the tax. Because the theory is that we're adjusting those prices and then we're letting the market do the work. So after the fact, how do we figure out, given how the market has worked, whether the result is due to the tax or whether the result is due to any one of a number of other considerations, such as fluctuations in prices, the general economic climate, changes in technology, or other governmental policies. We somehow need to segregate out the tax and determine what it has contributed to the final result. That's an area of inquiry where there's a significant amount of work going on, but significant remains to be done. But we do have some studies that indicate a degree of success. For example, studies of energy taxes in the northern European countries where taxes have been imposed on CO2 emissions have shown reductions ranging from 1% to 3%. In Finland, which has the oldest carbon tax in the world, dating back to 1990, we've seen a reduction of 7% due to the tax. The results so far in Germany from its broad-based tax look encouraging. And in Sweden, there's been a tax on NOx emissions from large plants, which has been attributed to, or which has been estimated to have caused a 25% reduction in emissions. Denmark has a tax on pesticides, and over a 2-year period, there was a conclusion that pesticide use fell by 10 to 13%, perhaps not entirely due to the tax, but in part. The United States had this tax, as I mentioned, on ozone-depleting chemicals. Studies have shown that that tax did accelerate the phase-out of those chemicals. So, we have difficulty implementing pure theory. We have the challenge of proving success. So, is it still worth pursuing the idea of environmental taxation? We have some success, but we have real challenges. And here I think it is still a path worth pursuing for reasons that I call tolerance principles, for lack of another term. One idea is that we're engaged in a process that uses an iterative approach. We should start out trying to design the best possible tax. But as we learn, we can amend it to improve it and bring it closer to the environmental ideal. Secondly, we have this question of whether taxation, in some instances, is the best available alternative. And I think in particular about non-point source pollution. Taxation can be very effective when we're dealing with thousands or millions of decisions scattered around the landscape. Taxation can send the price signals into those pockets and reach them effectively in ways that perhaps regulation cannot. We also have the idea that what we may be doing is instilling a cost allocation ethic. Even if we can't fully internalize the external costs in a pure Pigouvian way, we are starting to send the signals and correct the market failures that Pigou discussed. So we're starting to instill the idea of allocating environmental costs back to the polluters. And lastly, I think taxation can serve an educational function. It can send an educational market message throughout society, a message about which activities are environmentally productive and which are not. But also, I think government needs to market the tax, something it has not done in this country very well so far. It needs to explain the tax to people and to sell it to them to get the biggest environmental bang for the buck. And here I end with one last illustration, returning to Germany's carbon tax. After it was enacted, the German government mounted a marketing campaign. It, among other things, had a low-budget poster campaign advertising, "What does the eco-tax do for you?" Well, it received some responses, and one of them was, "Well, it makes for more sex." Seriously. This led to three parliamentary requests for an evaluation of the connection between ecological tax reform and sex, as well as a fair amount of media coverage and humor, which helped promote the tax. Kai Schlegelmilch, the person in the German government who's been working extensively on the eco-tax, has said, "We did not do any in-depth evaluation of this, but we imagined a blackout. In New York, you think back to 1967, when there was the blackout, and suddenly you discover, oh, there's a partner next to me sitting watching TV. And 9 months later, there's a jump in the birth rate in New York hospitals." Well, marketing the tax does get people thinking, perhaps not always in ways we anticipate. But even if the tax is theoretically imperfect, it's sending a message, but it can send a stronger message if government affirmatively takes that message public. So, in conclusion, do we have a viable environmental instrument or not? What is the quality of the emperor's new clothes? I think we have a rough weave. Invisible, but I think it's a rough weave. We need to refine the tax rates. We need to refine our ability to evaluate results. We need to educate policymakers and the public. And I think that we can take that rough weave, we can refine it into linen. I'm not sure that we'll ever get to silk because we have the inevitable legitimate limiting factors of tax policy considerations and politics. But I think we're starting with a weave that's worth refining. So we look to you for help as we go forward. We have significant work to do, and I hope that you will join the Society of Weavers as we work to create clothes for the environmental emperor. Thank you.
Okay, we have our panel of visitors here.
Okay.
Yeah, did you collect? Did you collect cards? Any other cards that I've collected?
Do I stand up there so you can quiz at me?
Cards?
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Our first question, if polluters who choose not to follow command and control style regulations require policing, won't polluters who choose not to pay their environmental tax require policing as well?
Policing? Okay. The enforcement issue. The enforcement issue is equally legitimate in both spheres. And the difference is that you have a different set of enforcers. In the environmental area, you've got the EPA and the environmental regulatory agents doing the enforcing. In the tax side, it's the IRS doing the enforcing. So different enforcers, but I think there's the potential in both contexts for evasion. And it's the obligation of government when it enacts these measures to try to sufficiently enforce. Part of this goes back also to the question of administrative feasibility. If we use environmental taxes, we want to set them up so that they actually are capable of realistic enforcement, that we're not creating a system that's so cumbersome that it can't adequately be enforced. But if there is equally the potential, one potential difference is that when one files annual tax returns, one does it under penalty of perjury. That's a fairly serious statement to be making when one signs one's name, so you do have that just psychological overtone with taxation. I don't know whether that ends up being a significant deterrent in people's minds if they're seriously not interested in complying.
Would the polluter pay policy allow for businesses to be grandfathered in?
Under environmental taxation. So if you have a tax that's, we'll say, taxing carbon dioxide emissions, and you have a power plant that's using coal and generating a lot of CO2 emissions, then your question is whether that coal plant could avoid the tax because we're going to write the tax so it says it does not apply to current emitters. Generally, one wouldn't write the tax that way because then what you're doing is you're exempting all existing emissions and only capturing new emissions so that you wouldn't want to create, for purposes of environmental effectiveness, you wouldn't want to create that much of an exception. But, for example, with the ozone-depleting chemicals tax, there were existing supplies of ozone-depleting chemicals that were already out there in refrigerators and car air conditioners. So when the tax came along, it didn't go out to all of us in our homes and say, okay, now you have to pay the tax. It started the tax at the point of new use and new production of products with ozone-depleting chemicals. So in that sense, you can have some taxes where existing potentials for pollution are in effect grandfathered out of the tax. Yeah, then, right. And often the comment was made that regulation can require recycling to address that issue. And that raises the point that it's very rare that environmental taxation operates as the only way of solving or addressing an environmental problem. It's usually in conjunction with other governmental policies as well.
How can we assure that the revenue from environmental taxation be dedicated appropriately on a global scale as well as within an appropriate time scale? And how applicable are these theories on the global scale?
Okay, is that two questions? Okay, first question is how can we ensure that the revenues from environmental taxes are dedicated? We can't, is the short answer. We can try through the political process. It's the political process that makes that decision. So there's no guarantee that if you are in favor of environmental taxation, that the revenues will be dedicated. That's the political decision. I think there are very strong policy reasons why you may want to dedicate the revenue in order to use it to remediate the environmental problem. But then you're open. What happens in the political process is once this new source of revenue comes on the table, there's going to be a lot of competition potentially to use that revenue. So there's no guarantee in the political arena that you can get dedication. It becomes the political game. And your second question was? International. So is the question whether we could have an environmental tax that is imposed by some international body? Currently, we're not set up that way because currently the tax system is conducted on a national basis or state and local basis. But we don't have any international taxing authority. The closest we have is in the case of the European Union, where under some circumstances, the European Union will have set taxing rules for all of the member countries of the European Union, but that system has not yet gone global. So then we're in the situation of the chicken and the egg, and this is what we see with broad-based energy taxes. Europe in 1992 was interested in a broad-based energy tax, but it didn't want to seriously do it unless the United States did it. Because if Europe did it and we didn't, then we would have a competitive advantage over Europe. They'd be paying higher prices than we. So until there is some global agreement, it becomes this sort of competitive standoff of who's going to move first and at what point do we have enough critical mass so that more people will sign on. But there's no institutional mechanism yet for an international environmental tax that crosses boundaries. I think there are a lot of good reasons why there should be one from an environmental perspective. But
in your estimation, which is potentially easier, changing the agendas of our currently elected representatives or voting in representatives with these agendas?
That one could take a few weeks. First, I think you have to start by thinking about the environmental agenda. Environmental taxation is merely a means to an end. So if you want to solve an environmental problem, then you have to look at the current makeup of the political caste and decide whether the people who are in are going to be more sympathetic to the environmental people than the people who could be elected. So one would have to assess that question on an issue-by-issue basis for each environmental issue. The other way to look at it is how favorably inclined we'll just take Congress for the moment, Congress as a whole to these market-based instruments. Is the current membership more favorably inclined than some future potential membership? And it's kind of bird in hand, two in the bush. It's always hard to speculate exactly who might come in. But I would say that the current makeup of Congress is very comfortable with environmental tax subsidies, and I would say quite uncomfortable with environmental tax increases or tax increases in general. At our current point, there does not seem to be a lot of momentum toward tax increases. It's the reverse. So if you could get, I think it would be very productive to try to start bringing more people into Congress who are more sympathetically inclined toward environmental tax increases. So if I had to guess, I would maybe guess on the future.
Which of these policies would be the most productive in the short term and which in the long term?
Which policies?
Which of the theories?
The theories. I think in the short term, we take a more pragmatic approach of not necessarily being theoretically pure, but saying let's go for a significant sending of price signals. And of the theories, I think probably the two that I would stress most in taking that approach would be the Pigouvian theory or the polluter pays theory. Both on the idea that what we're trying to do is at least partially internalize the external costs. The liability that I see in the least cost approach is that it's best suited when we're dealing with a limit of sort of point source pollution where it's one industry, one type of industry that's polluting. We're trying to regulate it, and we can make a fairly precise calculation of whether taxation or regulation is more effective. I think that's a fairly limited circumstance, so I think that we're better off using the two broader theories, but short term admitting that they're somewhat short of perfection.
One from the audience. What about using tariffs to, quote, level the playing field, unquote, when a country wants to improve environmental taxes internally without putting itself at a competitive disadvantage internationally?
Yes, and that's done, not through tariffs, but through what in tax terms are called border tax adjustments. So, for example, with the tax on ozone-depleting chemicals, we had a very high tax. It was, at its peak in the mid-90s, about $50 to $60 per pound of the most damaging ozone-depleting chemicals. So what happens then when we import chemicals not subject to the tax? What the tax did was say, for every chemical that comes into the United States, we at the border are going to impose a tax on that chemical so that it bears the same tax cost as the chemicals that are produced within the country. Or if a refrigerator is brought in, we figure out how many ozone-depleting chemicals are in the refrigerator and were used to make the refrigerator, and we'll tax accordingly. So that there's a way of leveling the field through this border tax adjustment that acts essentially like a tariff.
Can environmental tax revenues be used to fund tax subsidies for development of environmentally friendly technologies?
Yes, and that's another form of a double dividend. Instead of having a double dividend of the environmental benefit and then some economic benefit, you can have two environmental dividends. You can take the revenues from the tax increase and use it to help pay for other tax subsidies. So, for example, in 1992, when the ozone-depleting chemicals tax was expanded, that generated some new revenues, and some of those revenues were used to help pay for some environmental tax subsidies for renewable energy and for van pool subsidies in the 1992 energy bill. So you can match up environmental tax increases with environmental tax subsidies, and that becomes a very attractive form of tax shifting just within the environmental sphere. Another note on back to the border trade adjustments, one has to be careful with border trade adjustments since one is essentially doing a tariff that one doesn't run afoul of the trade rules under the World Trade Organization. And that gets into just another complex area with which I won't bore you. But that's just a footnote of one potential limitation on that kind of a mechanism for leveling the field.
Why do people tolerate huge market fluctuations of the price of a barrel of oil, but rebel against a small energy tax on oil?
Good question. Because here now, with what's happening with the price of gasoline, we see significant escalations in the last couple of months. Well, we don't hear a lot about it, but when Congress in 1993, when Clinton tried to do the BTU tax, and it resulted in just a 4.3 cent increase in the gas tax, that was enormously controversial. And that total tax package barely made it through Congress. It was a 50-50 split on the final tax package in the Senate, with Vice President Gore casting the breaking vote to pass it. And a lot of the controversy was over the 4.3 cent gas tax increase. And here in the last couple of weeks, we've had far more than that. There is, I think, kind of an irrational sensitivity that people have about tax issues. And I think that can be potentially very positive. But it's a double-edged sword. We want to use environmental taxes to try to get people's attention so that they'll change behavior, but it's very visible. People are sensitive to taxes, and so how do you get people to stand up and say, yes, I want to be taxed? It's harder for people to say that than for people to say, yes, I know the price of oil is changing. So that there's this there's this sensitivity to taxes, which I think is not rational. So my real answer to your question is, I can't explain it, but it's there. Senator Russell Long, the chair of the Senate Finance Committee about two decades ago, had a saying that went something like, don't tax me, don't tax thee, tax the man behind the tree. And it's that kind of an idea. People don't want they're happy with taxes if someone else is paying.
What do these theories propose to prevent a business from deciding to pollute and simply passing the tax onto the consumer?
Businesses often will pass the tax onto the consumer. And so, nothing prevents that from happening because, again, we're dealing with a marketplace situation. So then the question is, who's really going to respond? If business passes or industry passes the tax on to the consumers, price is going to go up for the consumers. So then, then the question is whether the industry will be sufficiently sensitive to consumer response to want to change the way it's doing business so that it doesn't have to pass that tax on. So they can do it. The question is whether they will conclude that it's in their economic interest to find alternatives to reduce costs so that they don't have to pass it on because of the risk that passing it on may dampen the market for their products. So they can pass it on, but if they don't have to pass it on, they'll have, and they can find other cheaper ways of doing business, then they'll be saving money for their consumers and producing products that sell for less.
Who is the polluter? For example, in the oil industry, is the polluter the car companies, the oil companies, or the consumer?
Can you repeat the first part of the question again? Sorry.
Who is the polluter?
Oh, who is the polluter? The oil company, the car companies, or the consumer? I don't know that there's just one. This is back to the chain of command. If we wanted, let's just take transportation issues. Detroit produces cars because we buy them. And the oil companies produce the oil because we use the oil in our cars. So we're all part of the process of participating in the pollution. And then the question is, which point in the process, at which point do we need to try to get the change? Does the change have to come out of the consumers who then ask Detroit or whoever's producing the cars for a different kind of car? Or is the responsibility on Detroit to produce the different kinds of cars? Or is the responsibility on the oil producers not to produce oil? We're all part of the link. We all feed off of each other. And so then I think it's a question tax-wise of trying to find the point that's going to be most sensitive to a tax and be most vocal in demanding the change and have most control over the change. I think that's probably not going to be the oil producer. They're going to want to produce as long as they can. Detroit, again, just using Detroit symbolically, Detroit will have an incentive to produce other kinds of cars if owners, if purchasers want to buy them. So for example, we've got now the Honda Insight and the Toyota Prius hybrids, which get significantly higher mileage. We as consumers need to help start building the demand for those cars to make production by the manufacturers more economically efficient, to bring down prices, to help generate more cars. So we can have an influence, but at the same time, companies have a significant influence by how they decide to invest their research and development dollars. So it's, again, a cooperative, sort of a symbiotic relationship that exists, but we're all parties.
How would environmental taxes be set up to deal with polluters of different income levels, i.e. small businesses versus large businesses?
This gets to a very sensitive issue, which goes back to this question, tax policy-wise, of economic effect and equity. From a purely environmental point of view, if you care about the pollution, you're not, in theory, going to care whether it's a small business or a large business, because 1 unit of pollution is still 1 unit of pollution. It's not better pollution because it came out of a small business. So it's really a question of policy-wise and in terms of politics, whether you want to try to give some protection for certain types of businesses. Generally in the environmental area, at least with broad-based energy taxes, the line has been drawn not between small business and large business, but energy-intensive business and non-energy-intensive business. With energy-intensive businesses, it's been kind of counterintuitive. Political and policy people have said, we don't want to put a lot of tax on the energy-efficient, energy-intensive industries, because then they'll be competitively disadvantaged vis-a-vis other countries. But yet, they're the ones that are polluting the most. So it becomes part of the economic calculation. But you can design reduced tax rates or exemptions for discrete types of business entities where there are significant countervailing policy concerns of a non-environmental nature.
Which is your favorite theory?
I go with the Pigouvian theory, the classic from 1920. And I think it's the most idealistic, but it's the one that I think most captures where we need to head in the long term. Thank you very much.